But I
Right.
also know some Africans don't even want to think about that. Some will say Congo, people have been dying in Congo for years, people have been dying across Africa for years. Who is trying to help, mediate in the crisis in a so why should I bother so much about Gaza? How
Yeah.
about somewhere, places nearer home where there are deaths? I mean, how many people were kidnapped in Nigeria last week?
Pan African Review is a platform that challenges assumptions about Africa and a space for introspective perspectives on matters of concern to Africans.
Hello and welcome to the Pan African Review podcast. This is your online spot for African discourse. I am your host, Mahatma Ulumwengu, and today we have a great show for you. Our guest today is Dr. Chika Esiobu. She's a writer currently based in Los Angeles, California. She's the author of Indigenous Knowledge and Education in Africa, and you can find her blog at chikaforafrica.com. We've had her on the podcast before. She was one of our very first guests, but recently she wrote an article in the Pan African Review titled Africa 140 Years After the Scramble at Berlin. Colonialism forced Africans to be beholden to the West, and post-independence realities trained Africans to hold on to that gaze. And as always, guys, if you like this, please like, share, subscribe, send this to your family and friends, and we will be back with Dr. Chika Esiobu. In your opening paragraph here, you write, quote, the projected trajectory for the continent, that is Africa. And just quickly, for anybody who might watch this who hasn't read the article, you try to detail, as your title suggests, Africa 140 years after the scramble for Berlin. So in your opening article, you write, quote, the projected trajectory for the continent is that the coming years will be marked by the upturning of the ill-fitting European foundation. So how do you envision African states, leaders, and citizens realizing this progression that you've laid out?
All right, thank you, Mahatma. First of all, I think we have to be careful with making predictions, right?
Yeah, of course.
We have to be careful, and much more than predictions, I think I will rather focus on trying to understand what is going on at this time. And it is in that understanding that perhaps we might come across some signal about what the future will look like. And if we are to understand what is going on today, we see that Africans are beginning to think differently because they have more access to information and more people are asking questions. More people are beginning to reconsider the previous thinking that whatever comes in from the West should be adopted. So
Right.
even if at this time Africans, for the most part, might not have that blueprint about how to transform society, there is more and more acknowledgement that the West is not the best, and we see that at the really macro level, the level of governance happening in Niger. We see the movement, Niger Republic, Burkina Faso. We see these countries that are standing up against long-standing imperialism, citizens going out to fight. And but that is just what we see. What we don't see is that younger people are beginning to question their education. So the older generation could not question that education as much because they didn't have access to information that could be used to counter the education they received, and
Right.
few people who could ask questions. So we see a growing anti-Western sentiment across Africa,
Right.
especially amongst young people. And if
Okay.
we look at that, and if we know that more people will have more access to information, then we can say that in the next 10, 15 years, Africans are going to be thinking differently. It will no longer be the generation that accepted and were beholding of the West that will be vibrant at that time.
Right. Yeah,
Yes.
you have a section here, which this is the part that I've like been mostly curious about that I've been asking people like Dr. Yusuf Surankuma when we've had these discussions. So from independence to dependency. So post-independence in the 1950s and 60s, was the dependency of African states on their former colonial masters, the West, an inevitability, or were there any reasonable and realistic prospects for an independent African state to govern themselves with full national sovereignty? This is back in the mid 20th century. Do you think the whole notion of African sovereignty and independence without dependency on the West, do you think that was ever realistic given those circumstances back then?
Um, that's a great question. And really, again, you cannot judge history except by historical standards, right? So
Right.
we are in 2024. It's a vastly different world than what existed about 60 years ago, 50 years ago. And I, I am learning as a scholar to not be quick to arrive at decisions or my answers, because there are so many dynamics that we will never have access to because uh, we're human. Especially when I did not indeed live in that generation. But what I can say is that it was a near impossible feat for Africans to achieve at that time,
Right.
in terms of being independent economically, being independent politically. And when we say these things, we remember that a nation is built on knowledge. And what knowledge did the founding fathers have access to? It was knowledge from the former colonizers. It was the political science textbooks used in the former colonies that were shipped to Africa, and Africans were told that if you are to be educated, then you need to know politics the way it is practiced in these places, and then you will be an educated politician. And if you are to be a teacher, the knowledge you need to teach your students will have to come from these textbooks written by the former colonizers and shipped to Africa. So it was hard for Africans to think differently, but some did. We know of some scholars who did. We know of some politicians. We think of Walimu,
Hmm.
Julius Nyerere, of course, always the icon that we want to refer to, who did try, and he succeeded so much until at some point the economy took a toll. The price of sisal went down, jute, which was a major export of Tanzania, and a lot of other factors that it became nearly impossible for him to not have to, depend economically at some point. So it was a difficult, and we know the stories of the politicians who tried, the governor, the Lumumbas who tried to stand up to the system. They
Right.
were killed for it. It was a difficult ask for Africa at that time to be, to definitely severe completely from the apron strings of the colonizers.
Yeah, and you touched upon it now in your earlier answer, but when it comes to dealing with information, the information that we have now as opposed to what our forefathers had in the 20th century. So how has this digital revolution of the past 20, 30 years with the advent of the internet and social media, how has that loosened the grip of knowledge that was previously monopolized by the global north? In your, understanding of this, what are the key aspects that have loosened the grip of knowledge that maybe people in the 1950s and 60s were not open to?
1950s, Mahatma, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s did not have as much, even up to the early 2000s, did not have as much
Yeah,
access to the knowledge that people today, young
yeah,
people, young Africans have access to. So previously across Africa, you enter an African university and you enter a library in many universities, and it's probably just a block, a story building with books. And then you go to the United Kingdom or you go to the United States or the Western world, and the library will be like 12 stories filled with books.
Right.
It's just simply intimidating. And researchers from these libraries will, I mean, from these universities in the West will be able to travel for conferences, learn from their colleagues, exchange ideas. They are growing in knowledge, they are building their ideas, but African professors will just at most teach students. They were mostly lecturers than researchers, people who could think
Mm,
through information, because the more information you have on a particular area, the more you're able to grow in your thinking and expand your thinking. Many African lecturers, professors could not afford to travel, as much as the other lecturers to exchange ideas and to, even think through their own ideas. They didn't have access to the books. They just could recycle old books from Europe. But what we have today is that meetings are being held, conferences are being held virtually.
right.
Right. African professors can just go online. There are many credible journals that are open access. There are many books that are open access today. So African researchers have more access to information and they are able to bring in their own thinking into this information and say, okay, I don't think this is the way it is in my own country. Perhaps it's this way in Australia, it's that way, but in this, that's not how it. And they can have the boldness to speak, having been exposed to different knowledge system, different parts of the world. They can speak with boldness. They can take decisions with boldness. And when we think of students now, students also don't have to depend on handouts. That's what we used to call it back then in Nigeria, where
Mm,
professors will just write handouts and sell to students. And that's all the information you will get for a particular course from that probably 30, 40, pages of handout that the lecturer has prepared and given to students. And these days, students who really want to study, and there are quite a few of them, there are many of them out there in Africa, they can go online and get information and read the critiques of some of the things that were passed on as knowledge to Africans, to our own generation when we studied, which we couldn't critique because we didn't have access to those critical voices. So
right.
this generation are going and reading critical voices and asking questions and using those critical voices to apply to their own situation.
Mm,
And that's the whole idea that liberalization, before it wasn't so. It was really the West basically telling people what to think, how to think, shipping down, trickling knowledge from that part of the world to
mm.
Africa.
Yeah. So what I really enjoy about your article is like you place, I would say, about 50% of the blame on the residuals of colonialism, if that's fair to say, and the other half on the corruptions of Africans and our leaders who maybe rely upon uh, aid and dependence from the West just to maintain their own power. So now we've discussed how knowledge has liberalized Africans, and that we're beginning to see through the deception that was packaged as education, development, and advancement. So, from your learned perspective, how should Africans go about dismantling the colonial foundations they've been accustomed to, and what is to prevent us from repeating the same corruptions of old?
Yeah, so we're looking at how Africans can build a whole new system
Right.
where it's really about the people, citizens.
Yeah, exactly.
And we look at it again from the point of young people rising, and look at what is happening in Nigeria. A lot of protests. People are able to mobilize more quickly to speak out against the entrenched political order. We see that across the continent at this time, really, more or less. In Ghana, we also see that happening. I think that will be the determining factor, where young people, again, They are the ones with the power, the number, and the information at this time. Young people are mobilizing and holding themselves accountable. And again, I think I used two words which I chose carefully. I used the word slowly,
Mm,
gradually, dismantle. It's not going to be a quick process because whatever is done quickly ends quickly or is overturned quickly. It's going to
mm,
be a process of slowly but steadily and gradually building in the field of education, in parenting, the way we parent, even in the names we give our children, and in the renaming of certain landmarks and areas that we allow the colonial authorities to take, continue to hold on to by the way we named them, and in holding leaders accountable, in saying that this system will not work. I know there are countries where there are calls for the whole full time political class to be done away with,
mm.
where regular people, market women, teachers, lawyers can become the senators and can meet over Zoom
Right.
and have conversations probably an hour a day or 2 hours a day while still doing their work and just have a minimal presence with secretaries. So those are the revolutions we're looking at.
Yeah.
Real fundamental revolutions that will not mirror what Europe has, because Europe is not Africa.
Right.
It will come, but Africa has to be patient. Africa has to keep working towards it, and it might not be in this generation that we will see the full realization of it, but we will see the glimpse. We will see the structures taking shape, and hopefully, our children will benefit more from that
Yeah, so
change.
I'm gonna read like an extended paragraph here. I was just going through it in your article. So it says, quote, in addition to this burgeoning connected youth, Africa has the richest concentration of natural resources such as oil, copper, diamonds, lithium, gold, hardwood forests, and tropical resources. When this emerging youth population sits up to take their destiny into their own hands, there is bound to be a drastic change. And then you go on to say Africa is a rising force that cannot be stopped. The only challenge for the global north in Africa rising is the potential for a backlash. So this is also like a two-parter question. So how have you noticed how is the West fast decreasing in influence, especially on Africa? And more importantly, when we're talking about a backlash and Africa rising, the backlash to that, what is to prevent another scramble for Africa in the foreseeable future? Because yes, we have all this natural resources in abundance. We have the youngest population in the world. But at the end of the day, what is that? Might is right. We don't have the same political influence and, more importantly, military influence that the West might have, to be acting with impunity. So how do you suggest that Africa might prevent another scramble for Africa? Maybe when the wars for water come in the next 60 years or something, people look at Africa again and say, here is an abundance. Let's, exploit them again. So what is your take on all of that? Because that's my greatest fear is that, yes, we do have all this, but we are still quite vulnerable.
I think knowledge is power, and that is one thing that we have to know. And the power that will manifest, we might not be able to again predict that power because we don't know.
Right.
Okay, the generation things are changing rapidly, but one thing we know is that knowledge is more available and that knowledge is powerful, and people will use that knowledge at the time that it is needed to do what they have to do to free themselves.
Mm,
That's one thing that is obvious, right?
right.
So we again look at Niger Republic. At first, France refused to withdraw their troops from Niger, thinking it was the old Niger Republic. What would they do? As you know, we're not going to go anywhere. If we leave Niger Republic, we'll have nothing. That's exactly the word. The words of the the decision maker in that situation. But at some point, they realized that this is different. Something that has changed,
Right.
and it's either we leave or we leave, and they had to go. And the same with the United States. which was last week that Niger cut off ties with him. Who would have imagined Niger, small Niger, quote unquote, taking such decision years back? Because the people were so, remember the French colonies remained so hooked to France, and they could access very little information. Of course, we don't have a lot of information available in French language,
Yeah.
and the little they had available was distilled before being broadcast. And we find that it's changed so much that they could go online and read Walter Road excerpts from Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. No one
Right.
would recommend that to any, university in French in France, but they would go online and read those books, and anger and questions. And we saw masses of people on the streets, masses of people breaking down the embassy. What French could not imagine, the docile former colonies daring to approach their embassy. But that happened, and France could not believe their eyes by the time they had to hastily withdraw from Niger. And we find that also replicating across the region. So the way the freedom will come, we might not be able to predict that. It has not happened before, but we know that knowledgeable young people are rising. What does it take today to, I mean, this is not a call for Africans to, of course, start mass producing arms or anything like that. I am, really pacifist in every way, but I'm saying that if it comes to nuclear weapons, what does it take? If you go to ChatGPT can put you step by step how to produce nuclear weapons. Anyone in any part of Africa can produce nuclear weapons. So it's gone are the days when those things were used to intimidate young people who have knowledge.
Right.
The thing that the issue right now should be to manage this relationship in a way that will not cause Africans to continue being angry or to grow in anger as they realize the enormous oppression and exploitation
Right.
that the continent has been subjected to over the years. That
Right.
should be the main issue, not flaunting military might, not flaunting economic might.
Mm.
Yes.
Okay. Well, just in closing, I wanted to ask, so you're in Los Angeles, California now, or you're in
Yes.
California, right? So
Yes,
what
I'm
is,
in Los Angeles.
yeah, well, with the this, I mean, I could edit this out, but I'm just genuinely curious before we sign off here. What's the general sentiment in the United States in terms of their flagrant disregard for international law, especially with this ongoing situation in Gaza? What's this general sentiment within the African community there in the West Coast, vis-a-vis the United States and their foreign policy?
Oh, great question. But I will not speak on behalf of the African community. People have different views, people have different perspectives about the crisis. But I know there is a general disenchantment with the the handling of things, the way the United States government is responding to that crisis. That will be the what I can say. It's just kind of a broad-based lack of acceptance, really, about how that response is not in any way trying to make things better.
Right.
But I
Right.
also know some Africans don't even want to think about that. Some will say Congo, people have been dying in Congo for years, people have been dying across Africa for years. Who is trying to help, mediate in the crisis in a so why should I bother so much about Gaza? How about
Yeah.
somewhere, places nearer home where there are deaths? I mean, how many people were kidnapped in Nigeria last week by gunmen, terrorists? But we didn't see that being talked about in that way.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about.
Yeah, that's a very real sentiment within Africans. It's that trying to get attention focused on African issues. But Dr. Chika Esiobu, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening.
All right, thank you for having me today.
All right, cheers. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you very much for sticking with us till the end. Be sure to check out our website at panafricanreview.com, and we will see you guys in the next episode.